Hello and welcome to CGMA's Roundtable, Managing Responsible Business, the Future of Ethics. I'm Nicola Marr, the editor of The Accountant, an international publication covering the accounting profession, and I'll be chairing today's event. Ethics is now as important to the health of a business as the financials, and in the wake of the financial crisis, investors and other stakeholders are calling for more non-financial information to tell the complete story of an organisation. Leading management accounting designation CGMA has conducted a global survey on business ethics, and in this debate we will be looking at some of the most important findings. The CGMA report shows a number of organisations providing ethics codes, and related training has increased by 10 to 15%. But business leaders are less engaged in reviewing ethical performance. Tanya, why do you think there has been a decrease in the oversight of ethical behaviour? Does this devalue the improvement in ethical rhetoric?
I think to some degree there's been an increase in people adopting codes, so that's what we've seen in the last few years. But where there's the mismatch is bringing a code into play, having that cascaded throughout your organisation, but then living that day to day. And yes, sadly we have found that when we look at the board or the senior management team, there seems to be a little bit more of a disconnect of actually reinforcing those codes and actually trying to embed those ethical values stated in the code into the day-to-day operations. So yeah, absolutely it can devalue, and certainly if an organisation has a code and isn't living up to it, they're at risk of huge reputational damage.
I mean, Simon, is this similar to the feedback that you've actually received at the Institute of Business Ethics?
Well, there's certainly an increase in the number of organisations who provide guidance to their staff about ethical issues, normally in the form of a code. That's there. We haven't detected that there's less interest in boards on this. I think it could be a statistical thing that's happened within your thing. If you asked a particular group, for instance, you said, who is responsible? And this time, lots of people have said everybody in an organisation is responsible, which is terrific and absolutely true. But I think it's probably dipped the other people, and that could account for that discrepancy in what we found and what the surveys found.
Brian, ethical culture, it still needs to be strengthened. How can this be achieved, do you think?
Well, I mean, one is adopting codes and processes, but I've always believed that example is the best signal to an organisation on the importance of anything, and particularly ethics. And in this particular instance, I think there has been an increase. I don't know whether the survey captured it, but I think there has been an increase in the sensitivity of boards to ethical behaviour. I was very interested that the survey said that the exposure of ethics within processes and procedures didn't seem to be translated into an increase in examples of decision-making being influenced by ethical behaviour in the way that I would have expected. So that was something of a surprise to me. But whether that's a statistical aberration, I don't know.
Do you think that, perhaps there is more need for regulation in this area?
Difficult to say whether regulation would do it. In this area, generally, regulation gets more towards the audit practice. Because that's more definitive, the role is clearer, and you can regulate. And if you take both the audit regulators and the market regulators, their interest is in getting independent auditors who will act as a check on the behaviour of the corporate management and stuff. I think the codes are probably the right way to go because they're global. The onus is on the member bodies to enforce. But I do think in the area, I've always been an operational finance guy. In my area, the code does need to be upgraded in the light of events of the last few years in terms of the behaviour of accountants in business and to reinforce the requirements from accountants in business in terms of their behaviour and their reaction to the pressures that they come under.
Can I just come in on that?
Yeah.
I disagree to an extent. I think regulation in certain areas are critical. I think that regulation has shown itself in areas like bribery and corruption, environmental, health and safety, a whole host of ethical areas where companies sit in board meetings and talk about what is the legal need. And particularly with economic pressures that there have been in the last 5 years, and economic pressures come in waves all over time, then regulation is number one on a company's mind. We have to meet the regulations. And even more than that, because of globalization, regulation has to be more global, maybe than country-based, because regulation in one country may be minimal compared to another. And a really ethical corporation will put best-in-class practices into a location where it does business. But there is so much economic pressure that they override that, and therefore regulation doesn't seep into those countries based on best practice that we might consider in our country.
I would also suggest that within management reporting, that you have kind of, as you were saying, Brian, you have the audit, which is the financial reporting, where you have stakeholders outside of the organization. And then when it comes to the more management accounting, your users of that information are predominantly internal, because usually it's confidential. So I think it can be difficult to regulate those things amongst global organizations. So I think where financial reporting is very external and is regulated by an external environment, I think that the internal management accounting and reporting should be owned more by the organization and the board, and they should set those standards within internally and their global organizations and how they manage that reporting and abiding by an ethical code.
Can I perhaps add a comment? I implement ethics because I'm ethics counsel for EMEA, and what I find is that ownership and that responsibility and accountability is helpful when you write it down in a code, because it gives people some kind of contextual identity of how and when and where they may apply those principles. I think it's great to think about the boards, it's great to think about all of those tone at the top issues, but at the end of the day, if you are an accountant or a professional, and I will use that word, what tends to happen is you have a sphere of influence that you can affect, and there isn't going to be an opportunity for you to just walk up to the CEO and say, hey, what do you think? You will have to reach your own professional conclusion. So many of those codes are set there to give that framework. I think in the context of ethics, if you are using that as a framework, you will try from your professional capacity to apply it to your organization, to your sphere of influence. And it's that support mechanism that the code will give you. It won't give you the answers, but it'll certainly give you some kind of guiding structure. And then at that point you will determine within your own sphere, within your own professional competencies and discretion, how you apply it. I think the interesting thing that I found in this report was that that cross-border application is really diverse. So everybody's got a code, great, fabulous. If you look at them, they're probably very similar, but then how they are applied is where you start getting the distinctions and where you start getting indication of pressure and how they then bump up against their code. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, there have been examples where, say, an American company has tried to introduce its code of ethics and values into, say, a Scandinavian country. And the people in the Scandinavian subdivision look at the code and say, well, it's very American, the language doesn't fit with ours. In fact, they don't even want us to translate it into our local language because that might distort the legal meaning of the code. So what we'll do is we'll sign up to the code, but really we'll sort of gently ignore it. If anybody asks, we're adhering to it, but we'll actually work to our local conventions and customs and patterns.
Now, I find that interesting because I do cover EMEA, and we do have a global code, and we work really hard to get the global code to recognise some of those nuances. So the bit that's really interesting in terms of the code of ethics for professional accountants is that the accountancy language that accountants have to use globally is consistent. There are accounting standards. So a large part of the ethics structure that an accountant will work in is quite different to other professions because there is that normalising. So it isn't that you have one or other geographic location saying we'll do it our way. What you'll have is the Accountants Code of Conduct, which Brian mentioned, the IASBA code. It is very helpful because it gives a starting point, and there isn't then this cultural disconnect There is, of course, that legal obligation, but when you start with an accounting code designed for ethics, and then you build accounting activity into it, and you apply the CGMA's professional competencies, what you find is everybody's talking a very similar language. And I know Brian and I have had discussions about this beforehand. This is the kind of thing that you don't notice, but that's a side effect that's quite helpful.
I think Nina's quite right there, that actually normally is, by the way. But the area that I think has been missing, I think it's been demonstrated by consequences, as I say, over the last few years, with code and codes generally, is enforcement. And that it's one thing to say these are the principles, they translate into these rules, you're a professional, if you don't abide by these, there are consequences. I think the consequences haven't been too obvious, that's the problem. And what I would like to see over the coming years is more transparent enforcement of the code. Very interesting to me, if you look at some of the countries most affected by the financial crisis, I'm not aware of senior finance people having been brought up on failing to meet the ethics code, when pretty obvious there was an absence of ethical behaviour, let alone legal behaviour in what they did. And to my mind, unless rules and requirements are backed up by clear and overt and transparent enforcement and exposure of the individual, they won't be as effective as they might be.
There can be a problem there, because I think sometimes it's useful to distinguish between codes of conduct and codes of ethics. And for codes of conduct, you can say you must do this, you mustn't do that, and if you're discovered to be breaking these rules, then we can enforce some punishment. But I think very often what organisations, they want to move beyond that and to sort of set a code of ethics which says these are some general virtuous principles by which you should all behave. And of course, once you move into that territory, then enforcement becomes difficult, because actually it's quite difficult to determine whether someone is living up to those high standards or not.
I think the question of enforcement is being brought about because companies began taking maybe a strategy of, okay, we have an ethics code, and now we've told everyone act ethically. But you know, they put that onus on the individuals, as opposed to, you know, setting a code of ethics and managing to it. You know, like you said, Brian, there's not really a clarity on what are the consequences. And I think businesses that have a very clear structure of that say, okay, here's our code, here are our principles and values, we manage our people to those, we report on those, and then, you know, people are more likely to approach others and discuss ethics when they know how it's being treated and handled, so that they know exactly the consequences of their actions.
Can I add a comment to that, though, because there's a different side to that. I think I agree with you 100%, but I think in practice one of the concerns I've had is a lot of the communications and the messaging around ethics are, you've got a responsibility, you are accountable. A large number of the cases I receive are people who are concerned. They know they've got this accountability, they're not quite sure how to do it, and they go back to the code and say, well, it says this, I'm really concerned. And the item that we've found, and certainly this report bears this out, is they know they've got the responsibility, but really what they'd like is some support to help them do it. And I found it particularly interesting in the report that you've got codes, but not many people actually doing the code. So you talked about implementation, yes, I agree, but a lot of the cases I see are people trying desperately hard to implement and then struggling. They're nervous, they're worried, they can see that there is an issue that they want to resolve, they're just not sure how to take the next step. So a large part of the piece around ethics for a code of ethics instead of a code of conduct is, this is how you might do something. It's the 80-20 rule. 80% of people really want to do the right thing. They're just not sure how.
Do you think that actually the size of the company should reflect whether a company actually has a code of ethics or not in the first place?
No, I think it really goes back to my point about using your discretion. as a company, if you have your tone, your frame, your structure, it gives people from the top down and bottom up some kind of framework, some kind of a skeleton within which they can operate. Most people really want to do the right thing. Most people are sure that if they were faced with something, they would know that there was a question. So in my mind, any organisation would have no, I can't see why they wouldn't put their own particular framework, even if it's 3 or 5 people company, to set out that structure, that set of principles, that set of concepts, I think is sensible. If you take it down then to a CGMA, the accountant is quite often in a very small organisation in a core position where they have the whole organisation in front of them in their particular scope. So why shouldn't they have a code just because they're one accountant in a very small company? I think there's every benefit to do that, if only to clarify this is the structure within which we will operate.
Yeah. We've obviously talked about ethical culture, and it varies by geography. I just actually wondered, Jeff, do you think that such variations across markets, how can companies actually influence a political or wider trading environment, or do you not think that they can?
I think it's very, very tough. There are companies like Tata in India, and there are companies like, say, Shell and the work they do in Nigeria, who have seriously made every effort possible to influence the countries that they're working in and influence culture around those areas. But it is very difficult, and companies ask themselves the question, is it our job to influence civil society and culture in general? And most companies are geared in a bottom line way, and we're quite simplistic mentally. We react to numbers, and particularly accountants react to numbers, rather than the non-numeric issues that come up through ethics. Most companies, therefore, will adopt an ethical culture in the way they try and do business, and will adopt that in those countries in which they do business. But rarely do they have an impact on those countries. And they have to, therefore, in many cases, opt out of working in those countries if what they deem to be ethical is not going to work. I would say that the only areas where it's possible are where there's a very large company which has a particular dominant position in a particular marketplace. Where that dominant position doesn't take place, then they're going to have a very hard time. Just as an example for that, or maybe even against it, Apple has most of its manufacturing done in China. The ethical position of a Foxconn, for instance, has a very different ethical base than maybe Apple would adopt in the United States. And to stop suicides by putting nets outside the building is its not only, but one of its main ethical responses. That does not mean to me that they have worked out their internal ethics, but Apple, which is has a dominant position, hasn't yet managed to influence a massive Chinese company in the way it does business.
You know, I do believe in a code of principles and rules, for that matter, but I think that most cultures have the same rights and wrongs in broad strokes. But I do recognise that that culture has a big part to play in just how rules or codes or ethical norms are responded to and applied. For example, on a broader basis, there is an Anglo-Saxon approach to things that, if you look at any of the more recent pronouncements on governance and ethics, the word is always challenge. They want challenge in the system, they want challenge from the audit committee, they want challenge from the accountants and so on. And that's fine in an Anglo-Saxon environment. If you go further east, there is not a culture of challenge. In fact, quite the opposite. It isn't part of the culture whatsoever. And that raises issues. So, on the one hand, you've got behavioural issues in applying what might be seen as proper standards and norms. And then on the other hand, you've got structural issues that go with geography and culture.
Can I just make a point on that? I mean, Brian's point is very, very good in the sense that outside of what we might consider to be our slightly complacent view of Western attitudes in the 20th century, we are now facing the biggest challenge to ethics from the newly developing nations, who are not now just small parts of the world's economy, but massive parts of the world economy and getting bigger. So Chinese ethics and the way they do business and the way their family and their almost Confucian attitude of if it's far away it doesn't matter, so we don't mind about their governance if it's outside our country, but we do inside, is a huge challenge to the ethical norms that we have been planting over so many years. And I think if the danger that we've got here is talking about large Western companies and their ethical standards rather than international ethical standards among companies throughout the world, and I would argue as well SMEs who have a very different mindset, because at the moment discussing ethics in small companies is not really something that they do very often.
I think I disagree. My concern with that comment is that that assumes that there will be a set of approaches, targets and behaviours that are then pushed out. And what I'm finding, because I do a lot of cross-border activity, global as well as regional, is that it isn't like that in practice. What happens is you have business teams, they're virtual teams, they will come together and then disband very quickly. And what you have to have is some clear guiding rules, and it's not rules, but it's principles, on how you interact. So the fact that you have one set of business structures in a geography is helpful, nice, interesting, but really the virtual team is a virtual team and they need to understand each other. So it gets straight back down to what Brian and Tanya were talking about. There is a common language of principles, of ethical ideas and concepts, which really is what Colin was talking about. And it is that that drives things. It isn't anything to do with the geographies anymore.
But if you talk to a Chinese mining company working in Africa and you start talking about ethics to that Chinese manufacturing company or mining company, it will be a completely different mindset to maybe the way that we have tried to input our own ethics. And when we have mining companies from Europe, and you just take a look at the FTSE 100, you see mining companies from Eastern Europe who, quite frankly, we would not consider to be ethical. But they are on the FTSE 100, they're raising money in the UK. Their lack of ethics compared to, say, a British mining company that has had to do business over years under our rules and regulations are completely different.
I agree that they're different, but I'm still not convinced in the sense that a Chinese mining company in Africa and a Chinese mining company in China and an English mining company in England have dramatically different ways of working. I think there are consistencies, and if you drive through a code of ethics, you get to those consistencies because you have no choice. I think in the past there was a geographical distinction, but if you look at the way that we share technology, we share information now, it's real-time live. So the Chinese mining company in Africa, you can guarantee they will be using the techniques, the processes, the procedures that they have shared. So that skill, and this is why it's relevant for this audience, we've got accountants, CGMAs, who are sharing their knowledge and skill with global organisations. So the knowledge flow is faster, quicker, immediate, real, and they have to be able to handle that real time.
I think when we investigated further into the market differentiation, we can see it's exactly that. The tone from the top of the organisation is wanting to do the right thing, but how do you start influencing what's going on in middle management? How are those actors interfacing with the wider economy that they're working in, which might have very different practices to what that organisation is championing? So it's how do you support management to do the right thing, not just saying, here's your code, cope with it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Companies around the world are increasingly recognising the importance of establishing an ethical culture. There are a number of influences such as business environment, geography, business size and sector that are having an effect on ethics. As we have discussed in this first segment, there is a need for more to be done from the top down.
The AICPA and CIMA require that their members follow their respective institutes' code of ethics in order not only to ensure that their organisations but also the public are served with utmost integrity. Through the CGMA website, you can access not only your code of ethics, but also a range of resources and tools, as well as support to ensure that you are acting ethically. Visit www.cgma.org/ethics.